People. We have over 50 people now. This is absolutely fantastic. I am so thankful for everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our program this evening. I'm going to kind of get started with the welcome so that we can get moving along here. My name is Carrie Whitmore, and I'm the Assistant Director at the Franklin Public Library, and I would like to welcome you all to Seed Starting 101. And I am super excited because I can't wait to learn more about how to start seeds indoors. I had a semi-successful year last year, and I'm hoping that I can improve on it this year. Our speaker tonight is Jennifer Lazewski. And she will be taking over in just a second, and she will be doing the presentation this evening. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Jennifer after I tell you a little bit about our meeting rules. So if you can all keep your microphones on mute during the presentation, it would be greatly appreciated. If you have questions that come up during the presentation, please put them in the chat. And then when the presentation is over, I can read them off to Jennifer and she can answer them for you. Okay. And then if there's any other questions that do come up during the question and answer period, please feel free to put those in the chat. Jennifer, I'm not sure how long is the presentation about?
It'll probably be somewhere around 40 minutes, depending how many questions people ask. I may pause at some point and to take the questions through chat as we're going through. So, there's a little variation, but I don't think we're going to be hitting an hour unless we have a lot.
We may have a lot because now we have over 60 people in the program. So
then I'm glad I have a little bit of a lean presentation so that we have plenty of time to get people's to answer people's questions, because overall seed starting is not super complicated. You just have to do the right things at the right time, and that's why it'll be great to be able to respond to people.
Awesome. And Jennifer did share a couple links with me to some really great informational worksheets or handouts, I guess. And I will also put those in the chat for everybody at the end of the program, and you can just click on it and have access to it. I am like so thankful you have the when to start your seeds. I was like, oh, I need that so bad. So
everybody needs that. Yeah. I live by that too. So, I'll mention it when it's up on the screen so that you don't have to panic. You can't read it or can't see it. We're going to make sure you have access to it by the end.
Okay. And I can even put it up on the screen a couple of times too, in the chat. I'm sorry. I can also put it up.
Yeah, or you can leave it up on the screen as we're taking questions at the end so that people have plenty of time to see it and understand the value of it. So
yes. Oh my goodness gracious. Okay. It's hard to keep
this is amazing. I knew that Franklin was a town of gardeners.
Yeah, we have almost 70 people in the program right now. So
this is great, because
so
I think you'll really have fun. It's just at the right time of year to be starting this. So hopefully you'll all walk away with something new or to do and learn and have some fun this year. When so many other things aren't as much fun, this really is something that can be a lot of fun.
I agree. All right, well, Jennifer, let's get started.
All right.
So I would like to welcome Jennifer Lazewski. She's a UW-Madison Division of Extension volunteer with the Southeast Wisconsin Master Gardener Association. She is the founder and chairperson of its educational Pollinator Group, an experienced butterfly and hummingbird gardener before becoming a Master Gardener volunteer. She continues to add native plants and shrubs to her small urban Wauwatosa yard and delights in expanding population of insects and wildlife that visit her garden. She also works on bumblebee monitoring and other community science projects with the DNR, local park systems, and nature center programs. And I want to welcome everybody, or I would like everyone to welcome Jennifer Lazewski. Thank you, Jennifer.
Oh, absolutely. If you'll just give me a second, somehow my kind of menus moved around a little bit, so I couldn't get
No
to
problem.
my slideshow start. I may have seen some of you if you've been doing anything at Ware. I do a lot of things with them as well. And I have a couple presentations coming up later, and I'll be back in April. I don't think you mentioned that, Carrie, just to let you know also to talk about things that are more related to my other work. But part of what I do as a wildlife gardener, before I became a Master Gardener volunteer, geez, about 5-6 years ago now, I was a regular gardener and I did a lot of containers and I tried to learn a lot about butterfly and hummingbird gardening. So there are some specialty plants that aren't as easy to find in the nurseries. So that's part of how I started with seed starting, is I have a whole array of special hummingbird plants that I'll start from seed, either because it's a lot less expensive than mail ordering them from California, or they're just not around here. So things like that can be great ways to enhance what you already have, or to I've now become a vegetable gardener since I've become a Master Gardener volunteer. So I'm relatively new at that, but most of the seed starting procedures are the same, no matter what kind of seeds you're working with. We will see part of that handout that we're going to talk about is more for vegetables. But there are differences between what you can plant right away, what makes sense in the ground, and what makes sense to start inside. But I have always been game for starting inside with almost anything that you can try that reasonably makes sense. And as I mentioned earlier, this is the perfect time to start, because most things, and we'll talk about timing, you have the amount of time that you need to get the seeds started, to get them hardened off, which is the process of adjusting them to outdoors, and then getting them in the soil when things are actually warm enough in Wisconsin. Because our temptation is to start these things in February because we're tired of winter, and believe me, I've done that too. And then you're kind of stretching them out and you don't have the best looking seedlings by the time you're trying to put them out at the end of May or early June. So it really is a process, and it's not super complicated. So I'm really excited that so many people are willing to try it. We all start at the same place with just picking out our seeds. And then we're going to talk about when to start those seeds, how to start those seeds, and then how to grow them, and then how to adjust them to moving outside to when you transplant them into your beds or containers, as the case may be. So this process, basically, this is one of the most exciting things to do in wintertime for everybody. And hopefully some of you have your seeds ordered already, or things aren't quite as bad as they were last year, but you can also get, especially with vegetables and relatively basic flowers, there's still a lot available in the stores, because this is around the time that most people are starting things. So it could be catalogs, it could be retail stores. You really want to do a little research to pick good sources with reliable seeds. Things don't necessarily need to be organic to grow well, but some of us have preferences in certain things. And so sometimes you have to do things early enough that you're able to get the ones that you want, or the heirloom variety you want to try, or different things. And even for somebody who has experience, I still start off with a lot of tabs on catalogs, a long list of things I think I'm going to do. And eventually you've got to winnow your way down to what is practical, what you have time for, and what's going to be enjoyable for you. I'm notorious for doing hundreds of different seedlings, and it does get to be a little bit of a chore by the end. So I would recommend starting off with the things that are most important to you, trying a little bit, and then build it up a little bit every year, so that it's never a burden, that it's always going to be fun, because it's very easy to do that when you're in winter and think, oh, this is going to be great. And by the time you're 2 months into it, or a little bit longer, you're going, oh my gosh, why did I do this to myself? So be realistic about your expectations. Also consider what you're growing and how you're going to use it. Again, you can have these great ideas and see all these wonderful things, but if they're all going to be harvesting at the same time, and it's not something that you really eat, you might want to reconsider, that you don't necessarily need those seeds or to spend the time starting them. For certain, especially vegetables, things like tomato plants, you want to pay attention if there are possibilities where they're more disease resistant. There's coding, and usually catalogs and seed packets will explain that. So you, especially for things like late blight in tomatoes, which is very, very common here, where so many people love tomatoes and love to grow them and don't move them around the way they necessarily should to prevent the diseases. So things like that, you want to pay some attention to if you can. And also understand that there are a lot of things that you can see and read about and even find in local stores, but they might not grow in Wisconsin. Especially if we have the late start to spring that we have had the last 2 years, where things are a little bit cooler, a little bit wetter if you're trying to do in-ground gardening. And timing is all important here. So most of the time you're going to be hard pressed to finish up your heirloom tomatoes before the season turns on you. So you might want to look at things like Wisconsin 55 that has 55 days to get to maturity, and some things that have a little bit shorter growing season before you can harvest. When you have seeds, most of them will last more than 1 year. They'll give you expiration dates on the packets. Sometimes that may be true. I've had seeds that have been fine for 3 or 4 years if you store them properly. So that's one of the key things. Seed packets aren't expensive in and of themselves a lot of times compared to the plants. But there does come a point that you can only plant so many seeds a year, and there might be 200 in the packet. So think about what you want to use, whether you want to share. We do that often. We'll trade things around, so then you don't have to buy everything yourself is another thing. Some libraries have seed sharing programs, so that's something to look for. And certain seeds do require those cooler conditions. So for me, I have a plastic bin that goes in the basement for the seeds that aren't very particular. But I do also have some that I keep in the refrigerator. Generally, because these are in paper things already, you can just put them inside a plastic bag or inside some kind of a container in your refrigerator. The most important thing when you're starting is to be familiar with what it says on the seed packet about how to make these things grow. They do research, they figure it out, they worked with it. You can look for other instructions, but you're probably going to see pretty much the same thing for certain types of plants. For the most part, seeds have kind of certain rules. There are certain seeds where you may not need to put soil on top of them. They need light to germinate. There are a couple of flowers that's especially true for. So it's important to understand what's going on here, and also so that you understand, as we're going to talk about, also, what needs to go direct outside, what you can start inside, even though it says outside. I said it's always worth a little try. Just don't give yourself a big investment. Don't plant a whole seed tray like that. But 1 year, you can try a 4-pack and see if they germinate inside and how they do with transplanting. Because not everything does well when you're transplanting it. If you're disturbing the roots too much, some things also like that cooler weather to start off. So you might be better off direct seeding outdoors when it's still a little cool out, compared to waiting until June to transplant and put them in. So it's really important to read the information that's already there, rather than just kind of assume. So for planting depth, often you'll have different things such as just cover, lightly cover, a 1/4 inch, a 1/2 inch. My experience is you just do the best that you can to figure that out. Usually if it's just cover or lightly cover, you're taking some of your soilless mix or your seedling mix, and you're just kind of sprinkling it over the top. And we'll talk about that in, the how to do section also. Half an inch, a quarter inch, most of the time, when you start off, you might want to take a ruler and kind of see how much that is from the surface. In some cases, I'll poke into the soil, but more often nowadays, I just leave a little bit of room at the top, and then I put the seeds in on a flat surface, and then I just put some more soil on top. So there are a couple different ways to do that, but basically you're trying to stick within the depth that they tell you here. For sprout time, some things can have a very wide germination period. I've seen things like 7 to 20 days. Most of the time it's a little narrower window, like a 4 or 5 day window. And we'll talk about why that's important when we're talking about germination. But you can't really change it. It is what it is for that seed. So you just have to be aware of it. That's when you can expect to see them start to come up. So it also becomes a factor in timing, as we'll see later. Final spacing tells you when you're planting it outside, how far apart it should be from other things. So a 1 foot space means you should ideally be putting things 1 foot apart. That can be important for the health of the plant, because if things are too close together and there's not good air circulation in between, especially in your vegetable garden, you may have issues with diseases and things like that. So everything that's on here helps you figure out how to grow this plant the best possible way, not just how to start it. When to start. So this is the big first handout that has been developed by our local extension office specifically for southeastern Wisconsin. So they have spring vegetable planting, which I'm showing you here, and the same document has fall vegetable planting, so that you can start to understand the difference between what we call cool weather crops or cold crops, and then your summertime plants. So for a lot of the cool weather plants, you have 2 chances to start the seeds and to grow the seeds in your garden, earlier in the season and later in the season. A lot of your summer vegetables, you still start indoors or early in the season, but you only get 1 harvest or 1 go around with them. So if you're new to vegetable gardening, it's worth looking at what can be put in at different times and leaving space available in your beds so that you can put in some of those fall crops later, so that you don't occupy every bit of space and then you go, gee, I really wanted some spinach at the end of the season as it cools down, but you haven't left any room for it. So this will help you figure out some of those choices and some of the timing, because it also tells you if it needs to go indoors, when should you be starting it indoors versus, when you direct seed outdoors, because they can be different times. So when to start, again, this is a focus on, we've got tomato plants on the left, and I would say those have probably been under the grow lights at least 6 weeks. It might have been more that year because I got a little impatient. And we're going to talk about the grow lights and the distance and all kinds of things that you see there. But some of those plants, you really want to give them a good head start if you're doing them yourselves indoors. You always have the option of going to buy a plant if your seedlings don't come out well or if they're not big enough. So tomatoes are a thing that everybody loves to have in their garden, and you really want to give them the best start you can. Not to the point that they're a 2 feet plant, when we're growing them indoors, because we don't have the kind of facilities that greenhouses have. But you do want to try to give them a good head start so that you'll be harvesting a little bit earlier too. Again, some things are better off in the ground. This is actually a sunflower that the birds planted for me. I wish I could take credit for it, but you'll find a lot of times your bird seed as it floats around the yard, may actually develop into sunflowers. There are, as I mentioned, other flowers where you're better off planting direct in earlier spring too. Sometimes that is a factor that they actually prefer cooler temperatures when they sprout. That's the time that they grow and bloom as opposed to a sunflower in summertime. To start off, you can do it all kinds of different ways. There are a couple of key things. You can use different containers, but they all have to have drainage. So you can see in the photo here, this is your typical kind of seed tray combination. And you can see it has the slits on the bottom so that it has drainage. It can also absorb water from underneath in the tray, which is one of the healthiest ways to grow seedlings. So this is kind of a traditional setup. You've got a base seed tray. And even if you're doing other containers, those can be really helpful because they help contain the water so it's not making a big mess. And you have to make sure you have the ones that don't have the holes punched into them. There are two different seed trays like that. One has no holes, one has holes. The one with holes is usually put on top of the one without holes, and that's done to like do a whole seed spray across with some of those small things, or for some of the growers that do, you know, a lot of transplanting or thinning. So you don't have to grow something in a smaller container necessarily like this. It just makes it easier to deal with it and transplanting and limiting the amount of root entanglement that you have, which can be important for your success when you're transplanting. The more roots are intertwined between plants and you're trying to tear them out later, the more damage you do to the plant and the less likely you are to be successful in that transplant. So it's just that those little seed containers, or using peat pots, or even, you know, an egg carton, whatever you have available, kind of the more it is the perfect growing space for those seedlings, usually the less shock you have in transplanting and moving things around. But you do not have to buy everything new. It does have to be clean, however. If you're reusing things from your kitchen or supplies, things like that, you have to make sure they are thoroughly cleaned out. And because we're going to talk a little bit later about some of the possible diseases, you really do need to clean them in with bleach if you're going to be reusing things, a 1 to 10 mix. And make sure everything is dry before you're starting so that anything, you know, that's harmful is also gone from there. You don't necessarily need a plastic cover. You just need, for a period of time in the beginning, to create a little greenhouse effect, to give them moisture and humidity to help most of the seeds start. So a cover is good, but you don't have to buy a cover to cover everything, because it's only a limited period of time kind of thing. When you're planting, you need a mix that is specifically for seedlings, or you can use a potting mix. It usually doesn't work quite as well as something that's specifically for germinating or seed starting, but you can use that. You just cannot use soil from outside. It's a completely different thing. We also talk about this with container plantings. You can't use garden soil either. They are what we call a soilless mix that includes a bunch of different things that give the plants what they need at that particular time. Mats, seed starting mats, increase the heat on the bottom of the tray. And again, if you've got plastic over it, then you've got kind of your little greenhouse effect. So it can increase the temperature, which helps with some seed germination, but you don't necessarily have to have it. So most of us, we don't necessarily start off with it because they're not necessarily cheap. We do recommend having a professional seeding heat mat because you don't have to worry about fire starting or things getting overheated and drying out your soil. It's just kind of a gentle thing. So it tends to be one of those things that you might do once you really get into your seed starting, or if you've had problems germinating or getting some seeds to start and they need a little higher temperature to do that. So when you're starting the process, you are basically wetting down the soil before you start is one of the easiest ways to do it. I take either a bucket or a bowl and mix in water with my seedling mix to weigh it down and wet it down, because you want things to be kind of compacted. Otherwise, what can happen if you haven't wetted at all, the soil is very light and fluffy, and it's going to get compacted over time, which is not going to give your roots enough to grow, is one of the things, as it kind of pushes down as you keep watering it and it gets wetter. So you're not physically pushing the soil down, but usually when that water is added in, it adds kind of some weight to it, and it pushes down a little more itself in the space. But it also helps create what we call this wicking effect, where the water from the bottom of the tray then connects to the rest of the water and soil in the tray. So you have more consistent moisture. So for the most part, it's just easier to start with all that in place. So I kind of mix it all up, and then I just take a spoon and, or a ladle, and kind of move it over into all of my seedling spots, whether it's a seed tray or whatever else it is. So usually you leave yourself at least ½ inch on the top, sometimes more than that, depending how deep your seeds need to be. This shows it right to the top. I tend not to do that. I tend to be a little bit below the top. And sometimes, especially as your seedling gets higher, you want them to have a little bit of space, a little bit down, kind of for stability. But for the most part, you're planting close to the surface. So it looks like here they've got some real small seeds. There are specialty items where it's like an eyedropper where you can, spread things out. I don't even bother with that. There's just going to be some seeds, snapdragons, and a few, small things where you're just going to have to thin, and that's the only way to do it. And they usually give you a bunch of seeds, so it's not usually a big waste of money or anything like that, but you just do the best that you can. Other things, big seeds, I'm thinking of milkweed because I do a lot of that. There's real obvious, you can put 2 in each cell pack from the beginning, and there's no thinning or sorting or anything. So you can kind of go from one end to the other depending on the size of the seed and how easy it is to figure out whether things grow. Now, sometimes you might want to put 3 or 4 in just to make sure you end up with 2, because not every seed is going to germinate. That's an important lesson. Different things have different germination rates. So you do kind of press the seeds down, then you put as much soil on top as your packets are telling you, or no soil at all, if that's what it tells you. As I mentioned, I think there are certain seeds that require light to germinate. So that's another reason why, to make sure you're following the seed pack and you know ahead of time what the information is. We've all occasionally missed something. So kind of my default sometimes is to just put a little bit of soil on it, and hopefully, that's what happens if you haven't remembered, because usually that will work. Even if it's sometimes that says no soil and needs light, there'll still be enough that'll break through on that. So then you've already got this moistened soil mix. We're not talking wet, soppy, just moistened. I typically don't put water in the trays. I kind of wait to see how that goes, because sometimes you'll have water going to the bottom of the tray, even just from wetting down the soil. But it's very important to have consistent moisture for your seedlings. So you need to pick up a seed pack or check. That's why sometimes it's easier if you have different containers in that tray, so you can easily see the water level. You're looking for consistency. So you don't want it to be wet all the time. You don't want the water and the seedling roots sitting in water all the time, but you also don't want them to dry out. So it can be a little bit of juggling and a balance, and you do the best that you can. But to start off, you do want to make sure that everything is moist. Usually how I can tell that is if you see some water pooling underneath, the seed tray or in the seed tray already, you're probably okay. So if you put dry soil on the top, which I sometimes do when they say it's just a little bit of soil, that's the easiest way to make sure it covers things evenly. Then you want to mist on top so that that soil is also wet and the seed is connected and in between moist soil on both sides to help it germinate. Once you finish a tray, and you'll also see there are labels in the tray. It's not in the instructions, but that can be a very important thing. Whether you write them on a popsicle stick or there are plastic ones that I usually do with a Sharpie, you have to make sure they're not too tall, that they're still going to fit under whatever cover you're putting on this. But you have to label them from the start. There are a lot of things that look very similar as seedlings. And if you don't label them, you might be surprised by what ends up where. So think about those things as you're doing this. And I use abbreviations. You're never going to fit a full plant name on a teeny tiny label like that, but do the best you can so that you can remember and learn to recognize as things happen, what that plant is going to look like down the road. And as you do this for a number of years, you can start to recognize them. You will also, though, if you're putting different plants in the same tray, because you don't have to plant the whole tray with all the same things, but you do it. That's part of why you have to label it, but you will sometimes find some escapees in other spots, especially with the small seeds. So I tend to start from the middle and work to an outside so that I'm not putting seeds on top of each other, or as they escape your hand as you're moving them towards the middle, they're going to sprout in other packages, other areas. So just think about little things like that as you go along, and if you're not planning to do everything all the same. Cover them. So again, we're talking about you're basically creating a little mini greenhouse. If you're using a heating mat, 1 or 2 trays can go on top of a heating mat. You can put them the long way on a heating mat, or I tend to put 2 trays kind of sideways because at least they still get some of the heat, and you can start more that way. I also tend to stagger things. So as you read through those packets, you'll see different timings. So I'll start with the things that have a longer germination period and need a longer time before they can go outdoors, down to at the end, the things that need the least amount of time. In flowers, it's things like zinnias and cosmos, which if you get tired, you can just direct seed them. Or they usually sprout pretty quickly, grow pretty quickly, and you don't want them under the grow lights for a long time, or you can get some spindly seedlings. So you kind of think about those things. So for me, part of what I've learned over the years is that I'm kind of starting a new seed tray or 2 every like 5 to 7 days. So again, you're not at the same level and the same level of care with everything all the time. You also get that fun part of seeing seeds keep coming up every week. So it's not just a one and done kind of thing. So that part can be really fun too. If you're not putting it on a germination mat, usually under the light source, things will get more than warm enough. It's a little different now that we work with more LEDs that don't have heat necessarily that's associated with the light. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out a little bit more into the long term, because I'm mostly still using non-LED in my grow lights, and they definitely have heat and they definitely warm things up, and you'll see condensation coming. So you just have to either move your lights or move your trays to check on things once in a while. You don't want things to sit too long in that condensation, and you also want to know when you need to water, if you need to water. So again, you can kind of lift up or check. You don't want to have a lot of water sitting in the bottom of the trays, but you do want to make sure that there is consistent water for the seedlings. As I mentioned, lighting has become a big issue. Most of us either, some people still do it in their windows, but it's a much more difficult thing to do. You don't necessarily have consistent lighting. Your plants are always going to lean towards the light, and they may get more spindly and not have good, strong growth when they start off. But that doesn't mean you have to invest in the $500, lighting kit either. There's plenty of space in between. Traditional things, especially with vegetable growers, is having shop lights in the basement and doing that. Now you have to watch, because everybody's basement, can have mold and fungus and other things that can affect the plants. I prefer to do mine upstairs. But I have a couple different systems that have longer bits of light. So there's plenty that you can do yourself. But it is usually, things do grow better if you have grow lights. And if you're doing your own lighting and your own creation or shop lights, it is recommended that you try to have one warm white and one cool white to give the plants the mix of light that they need. So there's a lot of information out there these days, but I would really encourage you to look at extension or university-based information about what kind of lighting is needed. And unfortunately, it's also new that I don't have it all in my head quite yet. So, and hopefully if we can too, I might look for a little more information on that to get to you. When you have the plastic cover on, you want the lights above the plants, but not right against the plastic. Again, if you have heat to your light, you don't want to be melting any plastic or causing any fires. So I'm usually at least 3 or 4 inches above where the plastic is. And once you start to see seedlings, you want to be somewhere around 4 to 6 most of the time. If you are working with a grow system, this is a place where timers can really help. They also have timers for germination mats, but they're expensive, and generally that's less of an issue. Or if you have to turn the lights on as soon as you're up and when you go to bed. So it's a longer day. It's not a 12-hour day. If you want to have the best growth for your seedlings. So that's why it can be easier, especially if you have your seedlings kind of tucked away somewhere that you don't walk by all the time. And you probably want to do that if you have grow lights, because they can be kind of bright. So that the timers kind of help you keep track of that. But again, it's not something that you have to have. And you can do really good seedlings with not much expense, doing things, other ways too. When your seedlings pop out, they'll have 2 leaves and they'll almost all look the same. So that's not to say they won't look different later, but they start off the same. So once they start, you have to start figuring out if you're going to leave a cover or plastic on or off. Some seeds, as I mentioned, can have really long ranges of germination time. So if it's something that's 7 to 20 days, you might have a fair number of seedlings start up, at a week to 10 days, but there will be a lot that might take 2 weeks or more. And it is important that you kind of keep an eye on that, because we'll talk about damping off, but you don't want to leave seedlings that have already sprouted under that plastic and in those very humid conditions for very long. You can play a little bit, a day or two, but not a week. So you do sometimes have to split apart seed packs, which I often do. I'll pull out the 4 that have most of the seeds started and get them out from under the plastic and, start consolidating different seed trays. I'm a complicated seed person, but that doesn't mean that everybody has to be. So, but you do have to pay some attention to conditions in making sure that your seedlings stay in good shape. So you keep them under the lights the whole time they're growing. That doesn't change. And you can start adding weak fertilizer in to help them grow. You have to be careful about which kinds, that it's not too strong, and that you're not using it at full strength, because too much fertilizer can kill plants as much as having no nutrients. I shouldn't say as much as, but can also kill plants. So you've got your start, your first set of leaves has this name, cotyledons. And then we'll see, once the second set of leaves starts, that's what's called true leaves. So then you'll start to see the differences in the plants. You'll see closer to what the leaves look like when it's a full-size plant. You transplant generally or thin. Sometimes it's easier not to disturb the roots and just trim out when you have too many plants in an area. Usually I'm working with the 4 sets of seed packs, and I usually don't have more than 2 or sometimes 3 if it's a small plant in any one of those little cell packs. So you have to be ruthless. That's the tough thing. If you don't want to be ruthless, you spread them around to more places where you're growing seedlings. So this can be, you know, I sometimes have a tough time, I'll admit, getting rid of them, but then you end up with too many seedlings and not enough light. So you do have to make your choices based on what you have, how much light you have, and how many seedlings you're willing to keep up, as to whether you're pulling, trimming, or starting off with only a certain number of seeds in a tray, and how you get down to what makes sense. Because again, you're going to take whatever's in that cell and be planting it in the ground. So you don't want to be ripping apart roots and moving things around at the point that you're transplanting very much. Occasionally we all vary that rule a little bit, but some things actually can't take that at all, and you won't see good growth on them. So your safest rule is always to just leave the roots the way they are, coming out of the cell pack, putting it into the ground. So you don't want to have overcrowding there, because that means they're going to be overcrowded as they're growing in your yard also. So again, after transplanting or trimming, you can start fertilizing a little bit higher level to help keep up the growth of the plants. If you have more compost or nutrients included in your pot, in your seedling mix, you might be able to go a little longer without fertilizing. But it's best to kind of keep an eye on this, because you have to make sure you're not overwatering or over fertilizing your seedlings too. So I mentioned trying to keep the grow lights at the right height. Basically, a plant will extend as it grows. So you don't want it stretching too far to get closer to the light. So you want to keep the light a certain distance. And you'll see here, I actually have a bit of a tilt in my light. That's part of why you have grow lights that have 2 chains, so it doesn't have to stay exactly even. Again, that might mean you're moving around your cell packs a little bit. I'm often reshuffling between trays, as some things grow faster than others, and I'm trying to make sure my light is at the right level to have good, strong seedlings. So another thing that you can do to help strengthen them is, you can actually set a fan to blow on them. You can kind of run your hand along them once or twice a day. That helps make sure that they'll be able to handle wind and won't break and aren't being too fragile. So this is the biggest problem with seedlings, is that they can get what's called damping off, and we'll get you a link for that. They've just come out with some new information from the university on that. And you also have a reference to a particular fact sheet that you can go to the Wisconsin Horticulture website and enter that publication number, the XHT 1124, and it will give you a whole page of information about how to help avoid damping off. So most often it happens when you've kept your plastic covers on too long. Sometimes it's something that's in the soil to start with, and when it has perfect conditions and you're not disrupting that at all, that's when you have problems and it can kill seedlings. So if you see this, just throw it all away. There's no saving things, and it can spread to other seedlings that you have. So I had one tragedy a couple of years ago when I was away for work for 2 weeks, and I was starting stuff outside, which you can also do for native plants. They need a cold treatment before they will germinate. And my milkweed came up at exactly the wrong time. And by the time I got back home, because I didn't think to ask my neighbors to check on it, with the covers on to keep the chipmunks out, everything was lost. It was already diseased by then. So it is something that you have to pay attention to and be careful about. Getting your plants moved outside. This can be, you're all excited, you're almost there, but you usually need at least a week to do this. So when you're figuring out, and sorry, I forgot to mention this earlier, when you're looking at the seed packet and it's saying how long it takes to germinate, how long before you can usually plant it, and oftentimes it's 6 to 8 weeks, you also have to include at least a week before it can get into the ground. So if you want your tomatoes in the ground on Memorial Day weekend, you have to count back. So you have to include a week to harden off, however much time they say to grow, and then how much time they say to germinate. So all of that kind of has to get worked into the schedule. Hardening off can be, there's a very particular way to do it. There's the way that most of us do it, and then there's the completely haphazard way that may or may not work. So ideally, you want to be increasing the amount of time that they're outside, but you do have to keep bringing them in and out. And that is in and out of the house, not the garage, especially if it's still cold at night. So you want to start off in a short time in an area that's not direct sunlight. Plants can get sunburn when they haven't been out in the sun yet. It is a different type of light than what you have growing inside. So you progress from a place that's not, that's more kind of sheltered and gentle, and you bring them back in after an hour or two. You progressively lengthen the amount of time that you have outside versus inside. And eventually you work them into sun and bringing them back in, and then eventually, your final placement and where they're okay. So during all this time, you have to make sure they're not drying out, especially when they're outside, and you may have some wind as well as sun that are contributing to that. It can be hard though. You don't want to put a ton of water in them before you move them outside because the water can slosh around. It also makes the trays heavier. And that plastic is not guaranteed to hold bigger plants, all your soil, and some water as you're moving it around, trying to just hold it in your hands. So you do need to be a little bit careful about that, but you can also water when you bring them back in. Hopefully that will keep them moist enough until the next day when you take them out. So it's just one of those things that you kind of learn over time. The last step is making sure they can stay out overnight. So you never want them to be out, when the temperature is not even just freezing, but well above freezing. You shouldn't be thinking of planting until we're close to past the last frost, and you can be hardening off. And if a late frost comes, you can still bring them inside. For Wisconsin, our average last frost is the middle of May, but that doesn't mean that it can't be later or it can't be earlier. So it's always a little bit of a risk. There's plenty of people who put their tomatoes out and then got that frost. So yeah, it's tough to wait, but it can be worse not to wait sometimes. So there's a couple of publications on here. If you go to the Wisconsin Horticulture page or something called the Learning Store, you can find all kinds of publications to help you with all of your gardening needs. So they all have search boxes. You can put in whatever you're looking for and find things that way. If you have direct questions, we do have a plant health advisors. Mostly they work with what's the problem with my plant, what is this disease, but they can also offer some general advice on things, like common things like what can I plant under my walnut tree. You know, if you're not finding information yourself, I would certainly invite you, you know, to call the plant health advisors and see if they can help you. So even though you see a 608 number, it is local. They've just consolidated some things through the state. So thank you very much for your time and attention. I am so excited to think about so many new gardeners this year and trying something new.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was awesome. I learned a lot of things. I took a lot of notes. We did have one question. It was about the heating pad.
Okay.
So some other questions are coming in, but they asked, is a heating pad okay on low on occasion okay?
I would say no. I've just heard one of the extension educators say, you know, you can't guarantee that. You know, maybe if you're right there with it, you know, I would not do that and walk away. It wouldn't necessarily light things on fire, but roots can be sensitive things. So it's not guaranteed that you would keep the plant in the right condition. So, you know, and I suppose we're mostly talking about germination, it's not recommended for safety reasons, I think, primarily. So if you are there to just do it for a short period of time and watch it, I still wouldn't recommend it though.
I wouldn't either. I will say that when I started my seeds last year, we did find a really inexpensive kit with the heat mat, the seeding mat, and the light, and the little greenhousey thing. I think it was under $50.
Yeah.
So,
and that's, you know, if you're looking to save money, seed starting can be debatable because there is some investment. But then when you look at, you know, it depends. For me, I've got small raised beds, so I will go buy my 5 tomato plants because I know that's going to give me a strong head start, and I'm not trying to plant 20 of them like some of my neighbors do. So, you know, there's a little bit of cost benefit analysis, you know, for anybody in that. Also, as I do the things because I love those plants, not because I'm saving money. When you get into the higher level grow systems or doing lots of them. But I think especially when you are talking about vegetables, there can be significant cost savings because if you're only going to have 5 or 6 of them, you're able to start the seeds, get them in there, and that's all you need. So, you know, I think it works both ways. It just depends how enthusiastic you are and how much you're trying to save.
another question that someone had was, if I decide to buy plants instead, do we need to do the same procedure as a seed plant?
Oh, no. The greenhouse has already done all this work for you if you're buying a plant. So depending on where they are in the greenhouse at the point you buy them, you may still need to harden them off. Depending how early in the spring you buy them and how our weather has been in the meantime. So for example, if you're buying them from a greenhouse that has all the doors open and it's been, you know, nice out for 2 weeks, they're relatively hardened off because the greenhouse probably has had everything open during the day for a while, but you may still need to watch if it's going to be cool at night or take a little time to make that adjustment before or leave them out one night and see how they do, as long as we're nowhere close to frost, and make sure they're going to be okay to be planting. But you don't have to do the growth part at all.
Another question. Is it best to start zinnia seeds inside or directly outside?
I do both, and usually they pretty much come out the same. My issue is often that I have all these great ideas that I'm gonna plant my zinnia seedlings, And then I plant so many different things, plus moving around my perennials as some of our springs have been late and we haven't been able to work in the ground earlier. And I do a lot of containers. I probably do 40 or 50 containers. So when you're trying to do everything all at once, those zinnia seedlings sit there for a while and then the growth isn't as good. But I think as long as you've properly done them, you're getting in the ground, you know, within 4 to 6 weeks, and they've had good steady growth under the grow lights, they're perfectly fine starting indoors. And some people do that also just to make sure they have their special varieties and things. Some seedlings will get eaten by bunnies and, you know, other things too. So usually you're safer starting indoors, but you may still have to kind of watch them, because you can also have spent all this time with your seedlings and something comes through and eats them in one night. So there always is a little bit of heartbreak with gardening at times. I always think it's worth the effort, but for things that are more prone to fungal diseases, like Mexican sunflower, which is a phenomenal plant for butterflies and bees, it is prone to some fungal disease, so that when you started it indoors, that might be already kind of be on there by the time you're planting it outdoors. So that's when I actually double plant. I put in a transplant and I put a seed relatively close to it, so that if one doesn't work, the other hopefully will. And eventually, and because they are big, beautiful plants, but you need a lot of room and a lot of air circulation for them. So somewhere on the southern part of your house, or in a nice open area that gets a lot of sun, that's a really fun plant to have around.
Cool. I've never heard of that one.
Yeah, it's Tithonia or Mexican sunflower. It's a big orange flower that looks like a daisy.
Oh, pretty. I'll have to look for that. We have quite a few questions.
Okay.
Do you have any recommendations for an easy to take care of first flower for kids to plant?
Oh, zinnias are a great one for that. I think they're far and away, you know, because they sprout so quickly and grow so easily. Cosmos start that fast, but they're not as interesting early. They have more kind of feathery leaves, and sometimes they get a little spindly and they need to be propped up. So those are a fun one to start in the ground for kids. But if they want to have it in a cup so they can see it grow, I would say zinnias are far and away the best for flowers.
Okay. What vegetables are the easiest to maintain for first-time gardeners?
Well, I'm not a super expert in that, but I am, you know, relatively new to vegetables. So I've had fun with a couple of different things. I've become a huge fan of carrots. They're not necessarily easy because you have to have perfect soil. If they run into any rocks or clay balls or anything, they will split, but try the short ones. You know, they don't have to go as far into the soil. I love having them right outside the door. I think everybody grows tomatoes. They're easy in terms of they will grow. They will, especially cherry tomatoes, will give you cherry tomatoes. It's just at some point the plant will go downhill. If you're lucky, you've got what you need out of it before it goes downhill. Some people are continually frustrated with them because they want to get, you know, tomatoes that take, you know, 80 to 90 days to grow or more, and we just don't get that out of our season. I have had great success with green onions, beets, and, you know, sometimes they're not quite as big as you would like. Anything that's leafy, you may have to cover it. I've been very frustrated by things like spinach and kale because I have so many white cabbage butterflies, because I'm a butterfly gardener. You can't separate the good butterflies from the bad butterflies, and the white cabbage butterflies, their caterpillar loves anything in what we call the cole crops. So that's broccoli, you know, kale, spinach, all that. So they seem to disappear on me. They never really grow very well. So some things you just have to learn and kind of account for. I've gotten not started from seed, but I know people who have started a lot of squash or zucchini from seed. That's an easy thing, but you have to leave it some room to go. I happened into a small plant that was summer squash last year that I trained to go more upright with a tomato cage, and it just kind of spilled over the sides, but most of the squash came lower on the plant. And we had, that all summer long, my neighbors and I. So that was really fun. So it can be fun to pick like one of something to experiment with too.
I always have crazy good luck with cucumbers.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, in fact, like everyone at the library gets cucumbers all the time from my garden because I have far too many that I could ever eat, even though we love them. So I think they're another easy one that you can sow directly into the soil as well.
Yeah, and you do have to have some way to prop them up. I think that's the only trick
That's
with
true.
that.
Yes, my husband's a handyman, so we have a lovely, huge climbing
Big trellis. Yeah.
trellis. Yes, I was trying to think of the word.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so someone asked, could you please talk more about damping off and how to avoid it? Also, should seedlings ever be watered from the top or only from the bottom?
Let's take the easy one first. You can water either direction. I just watched a presentation from a extension educator where she was talking about watering from the top, but you do have to make sure that you use the sprinkling part of a sprinkling can, because those seedlings don't have a lot of strength and you don't want to be moving around the soil underneath them. So you do want to be able to just give them a light sprinkle. I generally go from underneath just because it's kind of easier. But you do, as I said, have to be careful you're not leaving water sitting in there, because that's another way that you can lose seedlings from damping off, even if you don't have the plastic cover on, is that that's a fungus that loves cool, wet soil. So it can also affect seedlings that aren't under the plastic cover. The best ways to avoid it is to make sure your seedlings aren't in that condition very long, to make sure everything is clean and that you're not reusing soil and things like that. It's basically in and around, the soil. So if you've reused a pot from last year and you haven't properly cleaned it out, if that fungus was in there from last year, it'll transfer a lot quicker for this year's batch. So that's part of why cleanliness is also very important. So that can include, the work gloves you would use and things like that. You want to make sure you're kind of working with everything fresh and clean and sterile when you're doing seed starting. So, rather than use your gardening gloves from last year that are out in the garage, if you've got, plastic gloves sitting around, I don't use gloves, but just be careful about transfers and things like that.
Okay. All right, let's see what's next here. Okay. If I sow indoors, do I need to move the plants to larger containers before going outside?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. It's not a very precise answer, I know. It depends how rapid the growth is for those plants, if they're outgrowing their space. There are some things that I start in larger peat pots knowing they will hit that point, and some things don't like to be transferred. And that's also part of why you would use peat pots, because you can either leave them alone or just peel them back rather than picking up all the roots and moving them around. So things like certain morning glory, family plants, and sometimes they'll do that with the tomatoes, but usually they're fine moving out of plastic. So something like tomatoes, you typically do transplant because of the rate of growth it has and how long you're having it grow before you're putting it in the ground. You're not putting in a tomato seedling that's 2 inches tall. You want it to be 12 inches tall or 8 to 12 maybe. So typically with that, you do have to size up at least once and transplant into a bigger pot.
Okay. When you thin seedlings, how many should be per pod?
Well, that's like I said, you're transplanting whatever you've got in that last group is usually what you're putting into the ground. So you want to have narrowed it down by then. With the 4 squares kind of in the seed trays, I narrow it down to 2, sometimes 3 in each one of those 4 spots. You know, a pot that's on its own, I'll still also usually have only 1 or 2 left by the end. I'm a little bit different with my native seedlings because that's, you kind of throw a bunch of seed in a more open area, whether it's a bottom of a milk jug or, you know, just kind of a plastic container. And usually I'm too busy to do all my thinning the way I should. So sometimes those will either get kind of cut at the end or, you know, I'll take some out at the end, but that's not the ideal way to do it.
Is it at all possible to start veggie seeds in May outdoors in pots?
You want to bring them in every night, you're not going to see as good a growth. So I think that's the lesson with tomato plants and people who are anxious to get them out early, is that you can put them out there and maybe there won't be a frost and they'll be okay, but you won't see the same kind of growth in those conditions outdoors in that cool. You would have done better. They would have grown more keeping them in for another week or 2 and then putting them out. So, you know, there's a bit of a trade-off with that, because the better the conditions are for when it starts growing, the quicker it'll kind of take off.
How successful is winter seeding in milk jugs?
Highly successful, I would say. I usually do quite a bit of it, and if you search winter sowing, I think there's been a Garden Talk episode on it a couple of years ago from the Madison public station. If you just do Garden Talk Madison, you should run into it from WPR. That was done by Sharon Morrissey, our former educator in Milwaukee County. And it's a pretty simple process. Everything that you see for seed starting, you just do in a milk jug. You have to create drainage, so you punch holes in the bottom. You kind of cut about halfway through so that you can open it up. But basically the milk jug becomes your mini greenhouse with the plastic top on it. You leave it outside because these are seeds, and I should mention you tape it back up after you cut it apart. And so your seeds are in their little mini greenhouse, and magically, usually around the middle of April, it warms up enough and the soil warms up enough that they start sprouting. So the key with that is to do it soon enough, because a lot of native plants either need 30 days of cold or 60 days of cold before the seeds will start. So if you don't give them that amount of time on the cold, they might not start. But there are also some native seeds that don't need any cold treatment. And I do some of the fussy plants that need a lot of kind of up and down temperatures to germinate, like stick verbena or Verbena bonariensis, which is a big butterfly plant. That likes to have all those up and down temperatures that you have in spring. So even though I could start it indoors, I have better success rate when I throw it outdoors and leave it to its own devices out there. So you can, sometimes I do that because I don't have room under the grow lights. I will start some other things outside. But you do have to make sure when you do that, that you have some place to put it where it's elevated once they start growing, and you take off the tops. Because again, you can still have damping off. You have to make sure you take that top off at a point when you have seedlings to make sure all the bunnies don't just have a feast. So.
Oh, the bunnies.
Yeah.
If I have weed, tarp, and pebbles, can do seeds or bulb? Okay, hold on. Let me see. If I have weed, tarp, and pebbles, can I do seeds or bulbs outdoors or just indoors? I'm a little confused by that question.
Well, bulbs you can do one of 2 ways. You know, you can force them indoors or plant them outdoors. Those are, you know, pretty, the forcing indoors, there's a lot of good university information on that as well. And what was the bulbs and what was the
seeds or bulbs? They were just asking if they could do seeds or bulbs outdoors or just indoors.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of, most of the plants that you would do indoors, you could in theory start outdoors. It's just a matter of whether in Wisconsin, a lot of the things that we do are annuals, which means that they're not native or are cold hardy, what the cold hardiness zones are, our zone 5, um, that it's not favorable to their growth conditions. So if you give them a head start indoors, they'll do better than if you just try planting them outside, but others will do fine just outside. So it just depends on the seeds. There's not, unfortunately, a uniform answer for that.
Okay. Would you use seaweed in a vegetable garden?
You mean seaweed and not seaweed fertilizer, I assume, because there's a lot of organic fertilizers that have seaweed and fish emulsion in them. And those are perfectly fine as far as I know, but I can't say I know the official extension word on that. But I haven't heard or dealt with actual seaweed being laid in a bed, so I couldn't answer that.
Someone else asked, they're starting some seeds in cloches outside. Will this work for peppers or is it too cold?
I don't know the specific answer on that. I would suspect it's probably too cold. Peppers are one of the things that's more difficult because of our growth season here. You can get plants started, but getting plants to the level where they're going to produce a good size green pepper or fruit, that's a little tougher. That's why a lot more people plant hot peppers and small peppers now, having become frustrated by trying to do big green peppers. So it's not one that I would probably recommend that way, but it's not something I know specifically about, sorry.
If I'm using a greenhouse, about 7 hours of sun, will I still need to start indoors and move to the greenhouse as a second step? Or can I start right in the greenhouse and move directly outdoors when hardening off?
I don't have a greenhouse as much as I wish I did. I think probably your key to that is checking your temperatures. Because you'll see on the seed packet, there's a temperature for germination. Sunlight helps, increase the temperature in the greenhouse, but you have issues if you're right against the glass and next to the cold. So it's going to depend to some extent what the outside temperature is, where the seed trays are in your greenhouse, and probably what the temperature is in there, both during the day and at night. So I would recommend kind of investigating that a little bit before you decide you can start everything in the greenhouse. But I do know some people that start things in the greenhouse. So, it may also be if it's a little later or if they're not as temperature sensitive. Some things need a higher temperature to germinate and you might need to start them inside. So it just takes a little bit of investigation usually to figure out things like that.
Someone just commented and said ventilation is key in greenhouses too.
Thank you for the reminder. Because sometimes things can get too hot and you have condensation and damping off and other issues in greenhouses too. So and that includes when you have the little plastic ones that you can buy at some of the retail stores, like you can buy a rack that gets enclosed with plastic. So that can be a way to help with hardening off also, because it gives you a chance to protect things at night if you need to, when it's above freezing, but still kind of cool. But then you have to have it open during the day so that you have good circulation. You can't just stick something in plastic and leave it in the sun any more than you could to cover a seed tray and leave it sitting like that.
That was our last question. So again, Jennifer, thank you so very much for this amazing presentation. We had a ton of messages saying thank you and that people really enjoyed it. I do want to mention for those of you that are still here, Jennifer will be back on April 21st. That is a Wednesday. Again, it'll be at 6:30 here on Zoom. And she's going to be doing her Be Aware program, which I'm super excited about. It's about attracting local pollinators and native bees. So I'm very excited about that as well. So I hope you guys all come back for that. Everything that we presented here tonight, I will download it and post it to our YouTube page. So the whole presentation will be posted there as well. And there will be links to the 2 handouts as well.
Yeah, you probably were kept a little busier than you thought you'd be too.
A little bit. Yeah, we had well over 100 people, so it was a little, lots of clicking. So,
well, thank you everybody for your enthusiasm. It's great to see that.
Yes, thank you guys. Somebody did ask about if we would be doing seed sharing at the library, and I hadn't thought about it actually until Jennifer, you said something. So I'll have to think about that and keep your eyes open on Facebook. Maybe we will do some seed sharing this year. So that would be great.
All right.
All right. Well, thank you again, Jennifer, and we look forward to seeing you again next month.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.